We are now at FECCA 24 in Brisbane, and I'm with Asang Wankhede, an Oxford scholar who has worked on the phenomenology of casteism. Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much.
So I would want to just know in the beginning what your research is about, if you can give us a little overview.
Yes, absolutely. So the AHRC, Australian Human Rights Commission, and FECCA, they had done this call for national community consultations, where they reached out to the so-called oppressed communities in Australia to capture the lived experiences of their people. Caste was considered as one of the important framework which FECCA and even AHRC wanted to understand more in depth. So my role is of a lead researcher of this national community consultation on caste discrimination, run by two caste oppressed organizations, Sri Guru Ravidas Sabha and Ambedkar International Mission. Both are Australia based. So the work and the report which came out was to capture the lived experiences of caste oppressed people, because everyone knew that caste discrimination and caste prejudice migrates wherever Indians go. Dr. Ambedkar, way back in 1930s and 40s, said that. But the extent of it, the actual content of that lived experience, and also the nature of it was not known. This study, which was undertaken all over Australia by I worked as a lead researcher, but under the leadership of SGRS, Sri Guru Ravidas Sabha, uh, and Ambedkar International Mission, exactly wanted to do that. So we interviewed about 146 people all across Australia, all from caste oppressed groups, and in all major cities in Australia. Uh, the questionnaire that we developed, there were two questionnaires. One was for focus group interviews, and second one was for individual interviews. My job, and I think I should speak a little bit about my background now,
Yes,
little
please.
bit, is that I also come from the Dalit community. I hail from Nagpur, where I still live and have lived in a slum all my life. I am currently an Oxford scholar. I do my doctorate in philosophy in law, and I study caste and poverty in Indian affirmative action. Apart from that, my expertise really lie in anti-discrimination law, caste and international law, and identity-based and intersectional discrimination.
Wonderful. That is really good to know that Australia actually acknowledged that this is something that needed the work.
Yes, so I'll just give you a background of it.
Yes.
So 2022, it was really, I think, two or three projects which approached the AHRC to include caste in some form in their scoping report. In 2022, that was the really pivotal moment when we see caste being included as a form of intersectional racial discrimination. And that really formed the basis within Australia that why caste is recognized, and they wanted to for us to go more in depth and understand what is the lived experience.
Can I just ask, when you say you researched the lived experience,
Yeah.
did that include people from all over India who had migrated, different generations, men, women?
Right.
How was that?
So it was all over South Asia actually. So
Okay.
we were not only limited to India,
Okay.
because our approach was so it was an approach where we wanted it to be voluntary. So we reached out, of course, in a Google form, trying for people to register on their own, and people from South Asia background who are from the caste oppressed communities, right? So we were very particular that there are only, I would say broadly, there is only one caste oppressed community in India, which are the Dalits, or the so-called scheduled caste in the constitutional terminology, and untouchables. And of course, some OBCs, or the so-called Shudra caste, are also part who have experienced that form of caste oppression, exactly. So it was throughout South Asia, not just limited to India.
All right, that's good to know. As we've just spoken about, the Monash University
Yes.
has also included caste in its anti-racism policy framework. Recently, the city of Melbourne has included it
That's right.
in the discrimination framework.
Right.
Now, within activist academic circles,
Yes.
people obviously welcome these initiatives, right?
Yeah.
Some of the criticism that is leveled is that enough, or is that just restricted to policy, and does it have any real world impact? So I
Right.
would like your take on what that actually leads to, and from a Dalit perspective, What does that mean to you, or does it mean anything at all?
Right. So I think that are great questions. Like two things. When you were asking that question, the first thing came to my mind was when slavery was abolished in the U.S. Well, similar arguments were really made, and I'll come to the Civil Rights Act later in the U.S. race context, especially, and then I'll come to caste. That what have they done when, especially the southern states, would just not give up on their slavery or would still want to treat blacks differently. Now, of course, there is the criticism which is fair, which says that people's advocacy just starts and ends at wanting to get caste recognized or get prohibited within their local bodies or within their town and everything. I think if that is the case, then that's the problem. What I personally and the project really aims to do is to first start and argue uh, based on actual hard facts and evidence that there has to be a prohibition throughout Australia based on caste. Now, if we as project leaders and community leaders that I work with especially were to limit ourselves just to that, then that's the problem. Now, what we came up with, and that's part of the report that we published, it's a 210-page report, and the evidence is 600 plus pages of caste discrimination that we have gathered, is that in order to address caste in Australia, we have to have a multi-pronged approach. First, of course, it has to start with recognition that there is casteism in this society. That's what this report tries to provide hard evidence. My job as an Oxford scholar and from within the community was to provide the best methodology for data collection and best methodology for data analysis and interpretation, right? So I think, and that's why when we came to the recommendation, which was the end part, was that protection is important. I would say recognition that caste is prohibited and is illegal is important. But if we were to just stop ourselves at that, is also problematic. We have to actually do awareness programs. We have to do cultural sensitization programs, and of course media representation, and sort of just go out to the Australian society, irrespective of their racial backgrounds, and say that this is just not South Asia within Hindus a problem. This is actually a racism, a human rights problem.
I like the framing of that as a human rights issue because fundamentally that is the universal basis of that it's a human rights
That's
problem.
correct.
Of course, all of these other things are as much a part of it. You said one of your focus areas is the impact of caste on poverty. Is that something that is...
but not in Australia context. That's my PhD thesis
That's
at
your
Oxford.
PhD thesis. So maybe for that we'll have to have a separate
Please,
conversation.
whenever.
I did want to ask you that one of the things is that when the share of voice in this discourse, even in the most well-meaning spaces, right, is urban scholarship, is academia, and where the impact of caste discrimination is felt so largely in rural India.
Right.
How do we try to include that voice in the discourse as much? Because somehow it seems that academia does filter the best to the top, right? So obviously you must be a brilliant researcher, you're in charge of this project and you're leading it, and you come with lived experience, so your experience is very valuable. And we always think like there may be so many voices in underrepresented areas who have important things to share to this discourse.
Right.
What are your thoughts about that?
So I think I absolutely agree with that. Like the grassroots approach is very important. But I think that doesn't apply really in the Australian context, and I'll tell you why. But in the Indian context, what has happened is, of course, the criticism of affirmative action or the reservations is that it has only benefited some privileged Dalits within the community. Well, that is not true. The data whatever data that we have from within India shows otherwise, that the primary beneficiaries of reservations in India have been people who have been from the socioeconomically marginalized backgrounds. So that is sort of a myth. I think in terms of representation, I think the reality of who got benefited more from affirmative action policies, etc., is there. But what we are trying to also sort of see is that what kind of scholarship is also promoted by the upper caste. So we need to understand. First, I know that this is for only Australia, but I'll come to that question on India first, and then I'll come to Australia.
Yes.
In the Indian context, we need to understand how Brahminical hegemony works in university spaces and in research, right? They would want to only promote docile Dalits and people who are co-opted to the larger Brahminical cause within Indian sort of
University.
discourse, right? In universities and even media spaces as well.
Right.
Now, for people who are not docile Dalits, people who are actually wanting to stand for themselves uh, and have an independent voice, independent Ambedkarite voice, that is never taken on board because that really challenges the Brahminical hegemony that we understand. Now, coming to Australia context, what we did was actually went to the grassroots, because
amazing.
because we went to all the cities and then we had a one online session for all of Australia. Because it was based on voluntary basis, we had to make sure that that particular approach is free from any force, coercion, etc. But what we heard, and especially in the Australia context, I don't think that there is so much of the rural or the urban context. People of the Indian diaspora or the South Asian diaspora
Yes.
are mostly in the cities,
Yes.
right? So I think personally there has to be a lot of work done where the actual marginal voices are represented. But I would say that more in context of India. In our study currently, what we have done is we have actually gone to the grassroots and heard their voices.
Wonderful. I did want to talk to you a little bit about another aspect of this work from a so-called caste privileged point of view. So
Yeah.
I am also with Hindus for Human Rights,
Right.
and one of the stated objectives is fighting caste discrimination.
Okay.
So there's a lot of conversation about that, there's acknowledgement of that, and there's a discourse on what we can do,
Right.
as allies. What in your view is a tangible action or tangible actions that, say, in Australia, since we're speaking in Australian context, caste privileged communities can do
Right.
in support? One of the things we talk about is that a lot of caste privileged people in academia get grant funding, right? And a lot of them are studying oppressed communities, are studying marginalized communities with grant money that possibly, in all fairness, sort of belongs elsewhere, but they've got the opportunity to do it. So what are some of the ways you think that real impact can be made?
Right. So I think uh, I am no one as a lower caste man, as a Dalit man, to dictate what upper caste should do. No, that is not my politics. That has never been my politics. But what I think could be a few points, could be a good starting point, would be to recognize that how operation is structured and how that operation is not particularly only because of your caste privilege, but about other things that you have gained because of your caste privilege.
Right.
I'll explain that in a second. So caste privilege, of course, is not just you just born and you just privileged. It brings to you social, cultural capital, political capital, and economic capital.
Yes.
So in order to recognize for the diaspora community who are here, and as you said, Hindus for Human Rights,
Yes.
yeah, those kind of groups who wants to fight caste. So first recognize that it's just not your caste position, but the other underlying forms of privilege that you guys carry just by the accident of your birth.
Right.
Number two would be to recognize, to not appropriate the struggle for anti-caste. It's very easy, and that's what I've seen, especially in the funding context as well, that people from upper caste take the lead, and the people who are actually the community leaders from the caste oppressed background are made to take a backseat. I think that has to be called out, and that has to be, I think, consciously recognized.
Right.
Very importantly. And I personally believe that this entire Hindu phobia narrative and that reverse discrimination narrative has to be given away.
Yes.
Now we always see, especially in the Indian reservation context, that upper caste Hindus would always want to take that sort of line of argument that, oh, because we are talking about caste in foreign lands, that immediately is Hindu phobic, number one. And number two, that there is no need for it is because we are a sort of a homogeneous group as Hindus all, and everyone's human rights matter. That's not going to work.
Right.
First, what we have to recognize fundamentally is that there is no Hindu without caste. There is no Hindu without caste, and anyone who denies that reality is shooting themselves and making fool of themselves, but shooting themselves in the foot. So I think that recognition of that privilege that people are able to see, and of course appropriation point as well, but also very fundamentally at the core level is to let Dalit lead their own struggles and be comrades, be of course, people who want to collaborate with them, but do not appropriate their cause and do not, and finally, and that's what I'll end this answer with, is to not generalize their cause. When you start saying, oh, caste discrimination is there, but we, upper caste Hindus, are also facing some form of other discrimination, so we are as marginalized as Dalits. No, that doesn't work. I am very sympathetic towards upper caste who face racism. They do. That's the actual reality that we know. But that experience cannot be equated to the extent of saying, oh, now we are Dalits, or now we are also facing similar experiences to what Dalits face back home. I think generalization is a problem, and recognizing that, okay, if you're working, you have to give the stage prominence and work rather under the leadership of Dalit people abroad. Yeah.
Yes. No, thank you for that. That provides a lot of clarity on that topic. A lot of young people, and you know, we speak with young people who say, with some obviously blindness, that, oh, I don't know my caste.
Right.
I am caste blind, right? And I think that's a journey that people take when they start reading and learning and understanding that there is no such thing. The reason that you're caste blind is because you've never had to deal with it, right? So, do you think that we will, so the actual litmus test of caste blindness is when someone who comes from the community or who comes from a so-called oppressed caste actually can go through life saying, I didn't even recognize my caste, or I don't even know about my caste. Do you think that time will come in our lifetime when...
No, it will not. And I know it's a very somber note that I am striking here. That is for the reason that whatever literature that we have existing in anthropology and sociology shows that it's the privilege, the caste privilege of upper caste that gives them this power of doing two things. Number one is to, for their own rendition, whenever they feel necessary, invisibilize caste. Invisibilize their own power whenever it comes, but also monetize on the same power whenever it's beneficial for them. Now when we understand caste in terms of power and privilege, we in Ambedkarite community, Dr. Ambedkar is the biggest stalwart who actually fought against casteism to that level, right? And even he was not able to escape, despite being a human who actually had a clear approach towards casteism as a human rights issue. Even he was not able to tackle it. So people like us who have been actually working so hard towards it, I do not think it will in our lifetime be tackled. For the only reason that until and unless the upper caste do not recognize, first of all, their privilege, and they wanting to give away that privilege to have an equal society. But it's also not about upper caste. I'm not saying that the bastion of fighting caste discrimination should be on upper caste. Had that been the case, then people like me or other people would not even have come here. If Ambedkar had thought that, okay, just leave it to upper caste and they'll do it, or let them have their heart change, that's not how it's going to work. What upper caste should also understand, that they should be scared of the fact that they are actually violating the law. And I'm a lawyer, I'm a constitutional law lawyer. What they need to really understand is that back home in India, because of unfortunate criminal justice system that we have, we enable the people to get away with caste oppression, caste atrocities. But if they are trying to do something here in the race context, and if they are caught, they might actually also face deportation or basically a jail time.
The consequences.
The consequences of it, that. So in our lifetime, I do not see it happening. And even for such a long, even after our next generation, I think it has to be a slow process where we slowly dismantle the power of caste. And I think that will only happen when we recognize that how neo forms of casteism are taking place, when, of course, previous untouchability has largely gone away, but in Australia we found untouchability practice as well happening at a rampant level. But what we see is more sort of subtle form of casteism that is being experienced by people, and I would term that as neo-casteism.
Thank you for that. I know at this conference they're talking about shaking things up, and you have spoken about a multi-pronged approach. And I think that's important to do, that there are many ways to try and achieve this. And of course, you're right here shaking things up and informing us of so many different nuances of this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.